bit and taken a peek in there. I've entitled this particular message, The Impossibles. Not the impossible, but the impossibles. And I take that from Jeremiah. That's going to be our starting place, but you'll see it is just a starting place, but we'll see it a couple other times. In Jeremiah 31 and verse 37, where it says, "Thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the fountains of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, saith the Lord." It really is posing a hypothetical question from the Lord himself to assure his chosen nation of Israel that he will never and could never cast them off. They are his seed. He used an impossible to illustrate the point. And I believe that impossible still holds true today, and I'll speak about it in a little bit, even though our scientific advances are extreme and we think we know a lot more than what we really do. The list of impossibles, in fact, when I started looking at it, to me, when I'm talking about the impossibles, the list that we're going to get into, they really do some certain things. They challenge us, they teach us, they assure us, and they inspire us. And that's what I hope they will do with you tonight as we list them out, as we begin to look at them. In fact, the first one that we'll see is out of Job 38 and 3, but before we even get there, I'm going to just mention some things, because when I think of the impossibles of the Bible, I think of Moses, for instance, against the magicians of Egypt and against the power of Pharaoh. What an impossible task that he had to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Liberty seemed to be impossible. Maybe you thought a little bit further in that story might be the time when the children of Israel were trapped at the Red Sea and against the mountains, and as Pharaoh's army approaches, escape was impossible. Or maybe about Sarah being told that she would have a baby at her age, knowing that she was well past the years, and she laughed. Why? Because childbirth to her was impossible. I think about all of the unwinnable battles Israel faced, like even the massive walls of the city of Jericho. Winning was impossible. You can even think about certain overwhelming numbers that they had to face in the time of Gideon, the Midianites, and the probably 60 or 70,000 of them that were facing Gideon and his 32,000 troops, which God quickly whittled down to 300. An impossible battle to win. You might even think about David and Goliath. But we know how that story ended, but it still seemed an impossible giant to have to defeat. Or if we were to look further at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the furnace heated 7 times hotter, tied as they were and being carried toward the furnace, they faced an impossible situation, an impossible escape. You can also think about Daniel being cast into the lion's den, an impossible danger with no hope of delivery. Or how about Elijah standing before and against 450 prophets of Baal? Impossible odds. Then we see that God imposed a series of impossibles to Job. In Job 38 and verse 3 says, "Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me." He gave him a bunch of impossible questions. What about creation? What about its foundation? What about its measurements? What about the days, the seasons, the seas, the light, the life, and death. Do you have any control over these, Job? No, it's impossible. Can you control the constellations, the clouds, or lightning? No, it's impossible. He asked him about the fowls of the air, the beasts of the sea, or the animals of the wilderness. Can you control them? No, they're impossible. Can you undo God's eternal counsels? No, it's impossible. Job had great wisdom and conceded in the end of that conversation that he could not meet a single one of God's challenges that he threw at him. And he said this, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. The impossibles taught him something about himself and about his God. Then we know there are spiritual impossibles. You know that it's impossible to be saved by works. It's impossible to obey the law and be saved. Romans 3:20 says, therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. It is impossible to be saved by obedience or by good works. In fact, a little bit further on in the Bible, we read in Hebrews 11:6, it is impossible to please God without faith. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. The disciples thought it was impossible, or an impossible question, when Jesus asked as they were traveling with him, and he said, who touched me? They thought it was impossible. How could you possibly know that anybody touched you? Because everybody's touching you. But Jesus knew that there was the touch of one woman who was different from all the other touches. They thought it was impossible to identify, but Jesus didn't. I'm sure the disciples also thought that they were in an impossible situation when Jesus told them to tell everybody to sit down, and we're going to feed over 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. It was impossible. How about Jesus when he went to walk into Lazarus' grave and told him to remove the stone, and the comment was made that his body is no doubt decayed and it stinks. It's impossible to bring Lazarus back to life. But Jesus did just that. Jesus even challenged two blind men to believe that he could do the impossible. In Matthew 28 and verse 29, it says, when he was come into the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus saith unto them, believe ye that I am able to do this? But they believed that it was possible for him. Yea, Lord. Then he touched their eyes, saying, according to your faith, be it unto you. Every one of those Bible stories that I have mentioned certainly highlight the power of God or the impotence of man. They emphasize, too, how that even Christ taught how that faith can move mountains and how that the power of God can indeed do the impossible. These impossibles challenge us. They teach us. They assure us. And they inspire us. Jeremiah, in fact, during the time of the siege of Jerusalem, when Babylon had come to attack, he prayed these words in Jeremiah 32 and verse 17. He says, Ah, Lord God, behold, thou hast made the heaven and the earth by thy great power and stretched out arm, and there is nothing too hard for thee. Jeremiah had been thrown into prison. It's seen that all is lost or soon will be lost, and yet God tells him to buy some property for a future day of restoration. Then Jeremiah heard God almost use his same words in Jeremiah 32 and verse 27, where he says, "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me? No, indeed, there is not anything too hard." The answer is clearly no. Though the children of Israel had done evil and provoked God's anger and wrath, any hope of mercy and grace seemed impossible. Any hope of recovery and return for Israel seems impossible. But they shall be recovered. God promises that he will bring them again into this place. In fact, go a little bit further in Jeremiah 32, verses 38, 39, and 40. Look what he says. Here he promises, "They shall be my people, and I will be their God. And I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and of their children after them. And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them to do them good. But I will put my fear in their hearts, that they shall not depart from me." That is a fact that seems totally impossible from where they are now, that they're captives of Babylon. And yet, we see that with God, it is possible. The impossibles are with man. The impossibles are with us. Let me go back to our text again in Jeremiah 31:37, and again, this reveals the impossible. "Thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath," that poses an impossible. Can you truly measure the heavens? Can you really search out the foundations beneath? You realize that man has bored into the earth as deep as, and this is accurate, 7.62 miles. That took 20 years of drilling. And they found the heat to be at that 356 degrees in the earth. But we also find that that's less than 1% of the depth of the earth. As deep as that is. Man, measuring space is impossible. Man has a tool called the cosmic distance ladder, or extragalactic distance scale. They also use the standard candle method that has to do with the intrinsic brightness and the apparent brightness of an object in space. They use another law called the Hubble limiter, and we use radio waves bouncing off, for instance, like the surface of the moon, to be able to tell how far it is. But we really accurately cannot measure the heavens. We can only guess. Only parts, and some of those, even the fact that we know some places are more than 100 million light years away. What is God then saying? With all our scientific discoveries and advances, we still cannot measure the heavens. We cannot still search out the foundations of the earth beneath us. God is saying that his covenant with Israel is sure. He will not fail them. Though most of Israel rejected the Messiah when he came, not all of them did. Not all of Israel was cast off. Jeremiah told of his promise that Israel, we're talking about God's promise, that Israel will return unto him. They will be saved. And Paul confirms that fact in Romans chapter 11. Just as it is impossible for man to measure heaven or search out the foundations of the earth, it isn't impossible for God. In fact, in Isaiah 40 and verse 12, he says this, and you'll see this again. He says, "Who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand?" Look at what he's talking about. When you have that much water, it's like a few drops. It's no big deal for God to measure it. And he meted out heaven with the span. and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance. Imagine that. The impossibility for man is not an impossibility for God, and all this proves is that God is faithful to keep his promises. Another impossible is found in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18, where it says that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie. That impossible is there so that we might have a strong consolation, a strong hope, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope that is set before us. If God promises something, he will do it. He promises to be our refuge from sin, our Savior and our Redeemer, who can live. We can live without fear of eternal reason because he has promised and has obtained our eternal redemption. God makes promises and he keeps them perfectly. You know, even the promises that he made to David and the Levites. Here's what he says there in Jeremiah 33 and 22. As the host of the heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant and the Levites that minister unto me. Man can guess, he can calculate, but he cannot actually measure the sand of the sea, nor can he number the host of heaven. The stars are too numerous. These numbers and measurements are impossible for man. Just as those numbers and measurements are impossible, that is how much God will multiply the seed of David and the Levites. Job was challenged by Zophar and incorrectly charged with a lot of wrongs and sins that he couldn't number or list. But then he asked rightly to Job, he says, "Canst thou by searching find out God? Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? It is as high as heaven. What canst thou do? Deeper than hell. What canst thou know? The measure thereof is longer than the earth and broader than the sea." What we find out is that God must be revealed, for it is impossible for man to search out who God is in all of his perfections. It is impossible to go as far or as deep as his perfections are. Why? Because God is infinite. God challenged plenty of people. In fact, he challenged in the particular case again in Jeremiah 13 and verse 23, he said that it was impossible for wicked men to do good. He said, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin or the leopard his spots? Then may ye also do good that are accustomed to do evil." Through the rhetorical use of questions again, he's teaching that the sinner has such a depraved nature, and he is unable to change his fundamental characteristics because they become their habitual practices. Transformative power, in other words, requires the divine power of God. We need to know our human limitations and weaknesses. We need to know that we need to turn to God, that while things are impossible with us, they are not impossible with God. Now, we've already again read this verse, but I want you to see it again because it hits hard the impossibilities to man for such a minimal effort for God to measure the waters. It just makes me amazed to think again. Get the picture in your mind. Who hath measured the waters, all of the waters of the earth? God, they're just simply in God's hand. That's how easy it is for him to measure it. Jesus spoke that it's easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. And the disciples asked then the very question, and I know some people have strangely said, well, the eye of the needle or the needle's eye was a very small gate, and the camel had to get real low and scrunch down and he could get through, but it was really hard. No, that wasn't it at all. If that was the case, then the disciples were clueless, because the disciples then said, "Who then can be saved?" And Jesus' response showed that they didn't see a difficulty, they saw an impossibility. Because Jesus said this, "The things which are impossible with men are possible with God." You see, realizing our need is identified by some as a weakness, a frailty, and it is rejected because of that. Some believe that it is a failing to recognize our weaknesses and the things that are impossible for us. Yet, in fact, the Bible teaches that realizing our weakness is actually the pathway to power and strength. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 2 Corinthians, 12, 9 and 10 says, "He said unto me," after Paul had asked for that thorn in the flesh to be removed, "My grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness." Paul then said, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in stresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." You must admit your weaknesses. You can't save yourself. There is no salvation possible that you can achieve. Again, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. The hardest man to save on this earth is no different than the easiest man to save by God. You cannot keep the law. You cannot do the work necessary to save your soul, but God can regenerate and quicken a man and save them in a second. Paul learned that he was still weak after he was saved. He thought he was rid of that thorn in the flesh. If he was rid of that thorn in the flesh, that he could be a powerhouse for God. But he found out that his power was actually found in his weakness and his infirmities. Again, when I am weak, then I'm strong. And what else did we learn that Paul learned? In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, he said, "I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me." The impossible becomes possible through Christ. The trials that we must face, which look impossible, are possible through Christ. The work which seems impossible is possible through Christ who strengthens me. The habits or powers of the flesh seem impossible to overcome. Yet again, Paul said, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." To apologize to an offending brother, to forgive an erring sister, to love an unloving person, why, that's just impossible. But then I'm faced with the scriptures that say I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Do you believe this promise? We talked last Wednesday night about losing power. We talked and wondered about how that can be recovered. It is impossible for us. That man who lost the axe head, he couldn't recover it. But God could. And he instructed Elijah how to do that. If God has called you, led you, or moved you, then ask him for the power. Ask him for the ability. But I remind you of what the scriptures say in James 1 and 6, that we need to ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea driven with the wind and tossed. The Bible is full of impossibles. But every one of those impossibles, they challenge us to believe God. They teach us that God can. They assure us that God will. And they inspire us to wait upon him and his power. Again, we ask in faith, for nothing is impossible with God, and nothing is impossible for us when we are strengthened by Christ. The impossibles are there to assure us of the faithfulness of our God. God keeps his promises, and he will never leave us nor forsake us. The impossibles are there to assure us that we are overcomers through Christ. If I must face the impossible giant, God has given me the strength and a cause. If I must face the impossible flames, God has given me a peace that passes all understanding. If I must do that which I must first see as impossible, we simply need to cry out, Lord, help me to see that I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me. The impossibles. Some are impossible for us. None are impossible for God. I pray that's been a blessing to you tonight, an encouragement for all of us